inside the brain for this to happen. Well, let's go back to that statistic. What are those people who are obsessed with the internet actually doing? Well, if they're adults, either looking at pornography, sadly, or having illicit relationships. I'm pleased to say that the young people do better than that. They're actually indulging in gaming. That is the number one interest of your obsessive internet user if they're a young person. Why is this? Well, games, like many pleasures, sex, food, and music, stimulate the brain's reward system. But in video games, we have very rapid schedules of rewards, which are not very easily found in any other type of activity. And we know from studies such as COEPS that these stimulate the midbrain regions. Why is it important that the rewards are uncertain? Well, we love uncertain rewards. Now, this is actually an experiment with a monkey that demonstrates why that is. The amount of dopamine being released in the midbrain region of this monkey is being measured in relation to stimuli that it sees on the screen. Now, in the past, some of these stimuli have been associated with getting a reward. And you can see that the monkey is receiving a reward that has always, in the past, with 100% certainty, meant that a reward is about to arrive in the next few seconds. And it gets a spike of dopamine immediately it sees that visual stimulus. Interestingly, when the actual reward arrives, it was so predictable, there is no dopamine produced. Dopamine is all about anticipating. When the monkey sees a stimulus that has never been associated with a reward, in other words, zero probability that a reward is likely to arrive, you can see there's no dopamine produced when it sees the stimulus, the visual stimulus, but when the reward arrives, you do see a dopamine spike. The really interesting thing is when it sees a pattern which in the past half the time has been associated with reward and half the time has not. Then we see a spike of dopamine when the visual stimulus arrives and a ramping up until the outcome is known. If you integrate over time, it means that uncertain rewards generate more dopamine in the reward system than either certain rewards or totally unpredicted rewards. So we love 50-50 chances. And that type of midbrain dopamine that's generated by games may help explain their engagement, but it also explains why games can be very good teachers, because midbrain dopamine also predicts learning. We think that this occurs via increased synaptic plasticity. There is more, the actual connections between the neurons are made in a more efficient way, so it speeds up the process of learning. And this increased synaptic plasticity happens beyond the midbrain regions, in the cortex, in various different regions. Now that means that games are incredibly good teachers, very good teachers, and it's taken us by surprise. But of course, it means that it can teach a variety of different things. And there is a downside to this. One of the things they can teach is effective response. And there is converging data that violent video games teach aggression. We see this in correlation studies, where violent gamers appear to be more aggressive, experimental studies, where non-gamers' aggression increases after playing these games, longitudinal studies in which aggression varies with game habits. But again, how much is a factor here, and it's worth saying. I'm not saying that people should never play these games, but one should keep an eye on how much. And also a neurophysiological desensitization. So if you've been playing these games and you are confronted with images of real violence, your brain will produce a response which is desensitized, a less of a response, basically, when you see the scenes of real violence. But it all depends what you do with it. This is not the fact that gaming technology is bad. This is because it has been applied in a certain way. And we have exactly similar set of evidence to show that pro-social games teach empathy. And games that involve getting points for healing can actually teach their players to be pro-social and empathetic. So there is a decision, a moral decision, not about whether technology is good or bad, but about how we use it. So there is a case, I think, that we should continue to work as hard as we can to make sure we're providing information about what I call digital hygiene for users, parents, developers, and schools, about what sorts of uses of technology are a benefit and which sorts of uses of technology may present some hazards. But certainly there is not a case for the type of hysteria that newspaper headlines often try to generate. It's the same science and the same technology that generates potential for hazard and potential for benefit. Yes, there are some hazards we need to be aware of, addiction and aggression, perhaps, but the benefits arise from exactly the same processes, benefits such as learning new skills, pro-social behavior, and immense educational potential. What we need to do now is understand more about the science to make sure that we fully exploit technology for human benefit.
Let's start with this issue of what you said about games. It seems to me that this has massive implications for education, and that thus far when we've talked about the schooling, the way in which we've talked about the role of the internet and the online world in relation to schooling, it's been pretty peripheral. How much work is going on in that space, and what's your kind of hunch as to how radical it might be in terms of the way in which we've changed the ways in which we think about young people learning?
Well, I think for decades, researchers, educators, and entrepreneurs have been trying to produce educational learning games, and it's been something of a complete failure in many respects. It has been called a complete failure. I'm not sure I'd be that harsh, but clearly there's been a problem, and one of the problems has been that we haven't really had a theory to guide it. We don't really understand games. We don't understand how they engage. And therefore, to try to combine that with learning is actually very problematic. And one of the interesting things is that although many of the attempts have involved very sophisticated graphics and really very wonderful technology, I think the very principle of gaming in terms of why we find it enjoyable and how it helps us learn has been left out. And I think that neuroscience has an awful lot to offer there.
But the incentives, the way in which the technology works with learning is not to do with a specific characteristic of the technology. That's to do with what helps us to learn. I mean, I could take it from your evidence, for example. Because she has a terrible life being my PA, I buy my PA a bunch of flowers every Monday morning, but it suggests to me she would get more pleasure if I bought them once every 2 weeks in a rather random way in order that the dopamine release would be better. I'm going to explain this to her tomorrow. But
yeah, I mean, essentially you're right.
This isn't a function of technology. This occasional reward thing is something that is characteristic of all.
I mean, you're absolutely right, because one of the things we've tried to do, I'm deviating slightly towards another project that I'm involved with, but we've been trying to test this out in a classroom to find out if it's actually true that giving uncertain reward engages children more. And we found that it does seem to be the case. I mean, it began for me when the children were arguing about who was going to sit in the front seat of the car, and I found that by tossing a coin, they were much happier with the outcome, and it became something that they actually enjoyed, and usually we'd have lots of arguments. So what we did was to ask children whether they would prefer to have their question from Mr. Certain, who would give them a point if they got it correct, or Mr. Uncertain, who'd toss a coin, they get 2 points or no points. And the preference for having their rewards and asking their questions from Mr. Uncertain rose throughout the maths lesson. But it's particularly, it has to be said amongst boys, so you might have to be a little bit careful of that issue. I think there probably is a strong gender effect here. We've been telling children, we've been telling teachers, Ofsted have been telling people for a long time that motivation is all about reward consistency. If a child knows the answer, they should have the point, basically. But no, they will be more engaged and more motivated if by getting the right answer, they have a chance to win a point. That is more engaging.
What about one of the consistent concerns that people have expressed about technology, and particularly technology in young people? Zimbardo, for example, gave a lecture on this subject, which is the impact on attention spans. And you talked about these reward systems, but is it the fact that the reward has to come very quickly? And what does that do to our impact for genuine delayed gratification? Now, in the video games, the feedback mechanisms are very, very fast. It's not work hard and then at the after three quarters now we'll tell you whether you've done well. So what's the state of play on this notion that the online world and the gaming world reduces our capacity for deferred gratification beyond a few seconds?
I mean, I certainly would never suggest that gaming in a classroom should substitute for the ability to hold one's attention in a fixed way, whilst reading a book. I think that's very important. Whether technology actually damages that ability, I think is very moot. It certainly wouldn't be appropriate to say that we have evidence, for example, that playing lots of video games causes ADHD. If, however, you were going to say, but can it disrupt behaviour in the classroom simply because the child has got something more interesting to do, they'd rather get home and do, and they're now finding the lesson rather boring because they've got a very exciting video game at home. Yes, I think that is true, and in fact there's a good study that shows that, whereby they took...
so in a way it's not technology's fault, it's reality's fault.
It's reality's fault.
Because reality can't get as improve as quickly as the technology.
Exactly. The fact is they are very engaging, and they gave children video games that had never experienced them, and after 6 months, compared with the group who hadn't got the video games, their literacy levels had dropped and their behaviour in class had dropped as well. But then you don't know that wouldn't have been exactly the same result if you'd given them a pony or something else that was really exciting and engaging for when they got home. And let's face it, yes, you're right. I mean, this is a reality issue. They're here. We are competing with these machines, and we need to understand why they're such good fun so that we can take those processes and apply them in the classroom and have lessons that are just as exciting.
I remember someone saying to me that if you're a great teacher, you will always beat games because there's something about the passion and the connection that you will have. But it's a pretty miserable future for you if you're a mediocre teacher, because the gap between what you can do and what can be done online is going to grow ever bigger. If the human, if the real, if the non-online can't add value to the online experience, it's going to be increasingly finding itself pushed to the margin.
Well, I mean, one of the approaches that we've been trying out lately has been a whole class gaming experience. So you're teaching and learning entirely through gaming using technology. And in fact, it's been so successful with children that I now teach postgraduate neuroscience using the same method for half the unit. And I was expecting them to be up in arms about it, but they love it, it's great. And I'm a fairly mediocre teacher. So I think, I think there is chance for us, I think there's hope for us.